Government Business. Order of the Day number 1. Defence Amendment Safeguarding Australia's Military Secrets Bill 2023. Resumption of debate on second reading.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time. I give the call to the member for Canning.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It goes without saying in this chamber that we are indeed living in dangerous times. The government has said as much over the last year in the Defence Strategic Review and on other occasions. The strategic order that we have enjoyed since the end of the Second World War has broken down into disorder. We see this in the South China Sea, we see it in the Red Sea, we see it in Israel and Gaza, and we see it in the Ukraine. And it's the authoritarian powers which are the source of this strategic disorder. And Australia, over the last couple of years, has had to rethink our defence posture to build our capacity to deter an adversary, but also to maintain our edge in a warfighting scenario, which is why the former coalition government moved to acquire nuclear-powered submarines through AUKUS, and that was supported by the Labor Party. And last year, the Albanese government selected the Virginia-class submarines and SSN AUKUS as the optimal pathway moving forward. Now we find ourselves today in the chamber and we are debating two bills which enable AUKUS. It's about executing the plan and building out the legislative framework that will bring Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 of AUKUS to life. It's about building a uniform system of export controls and offences across our three countries, the US, the UK and Australia. And the laws that we pass today interact directly with the United States, and the law that was passed in Congress last year on December 15, 2023, the 2024 National Defence Authorisation Act. It was hugely significant for Australia. Much of the public missed that, but I just want to restate exactly what that bill means for Australia. It established a national exemption for Australia and the UK from US defence export licensing and adds Australia and the USA to the Defence Production Act. Specifically, it authorises the transfer of 3 Virginia-class submarines to Australia. It also authorised the maintenance of US nuclear submarines in Australia, which is a critical part of the optimal pathway, and establishing Submarine Rotational Force West. And I think this has implications for small to medium enterprises, particularly in Perth, who will be part of the supply chain and the deep sustainment of our US and UK partners, and including our own submarines when they pass into our hands. The NDAA also authorises Australian contractors to train in US shipyards to support the development of Australia's submarine industrial base. And I know the Deputy Prime Minister would be watching that closely as we send over industry workers, APS and ADF personnel to understand the very complex system that is a US shipyard. It also establishes a mechanism for the US to accept funds from Australia to lift the capacity of the US industrial base, particularly their shipyards, which will increase the submarine delivery cadence, which is below 2, to above 2. If AUKUS is going to be realised, those submarines need to be popping out at a higher rate than 2 per year. And the funding that we give to the US helps them scale up and improve their efficiency in their shipyards. The NDAA also gives Australia a national exemption from US export control licensing requirements, enabling the free flow and transfer of controlled goods and technology between our three countries, enabling Pillar 2 particularly. It will increase the speed of foreign military sales and exports not covered by the national exemption. And finally, it adds Australia and the UK to Title III of the US Defence Production Act, opening new opportunities for Australian small to medium enterprises as part of the US, as the US production base expands. But, Mr Speaker, here's the catch. Section 1343 of the National Defence Authorisation Act requires within 120 days that the US President determine and certify in writing that Australia has, 1, implemented a system of export controls comparable to the US, and number 2, implemented a comparable exemption from their export controls for the USA. And the Defence Trade Controls Amendment Bill and the Safeguarding Australia's Military Secrets Bill establishes that comparable export control system, which is a really important signal that we send to the Americans that we're taking this seriously and that we're building uniformity into our system. Now, this involved us accelerating these bills through the PJCIS for the Safeguarding Australia's Military Secrets Bill, but it also accelerated the Defence Trade Controls Amendment Bill through the Senate Defence, Foreign Affairs and Trade Committee. and I want to commend Senator Fawcett for the work that he did collaborating with his Labor colleagues in that committee. For the children sitting up here, this is very significant today. We are passing legislation that will bring nuclear-powered submarines to our country, but it's more than just the submarines. This is a massive national endeavour. We're going to rebuild our Australian industrial base. The jobs of the future are going to be incredible for young Australians, whether they're serving in uniform, whether they're supporting industry, whether they start a small to medium or a large business of their own that supports our submarines, and of course there'll be plenty of jobs in government to make sure that this happens. So these bills implement the export control regime that is required by Congress, and it means that President Joe Biden, kids again, you've seen him on the TV, he'll be able to sign off and say that Australia has met its obligations through this parliament. Now, I do want to raise that there were concerns with academic and defence industry stakeholders. They have expressed concerns about the regulatory burden and the unintended consequences of these bills, but they appreciate in the national interest that we need to move quickly on this. This year is a big year for Australia, for the US and the UK. We know there's a presidential election in November. Who knows when the election will be held here, potentially November. We'll be ready, regardless. And of course, in the UK, we can expect an election no later than January next year. So it's really important that we establish this export control regime in Q1 and Q2 of this year. And it looks like we're going to get there working on a bipartisan basis. I'd also want to acknowledge Ambassador Kennedy and Ambassador Rudd, who provide briefings to the opposition on this, and that was helpful as we considered this. During the committee process in the Senate, we are very glad to receive the recommendations that there will be a statutory review within 3 years of the Defence Trade Controls Amendment Bill, that industry working groups established by Defence will be used for the co-design of the regulations, as well as the transition and implementation of the regime. And finally, we're very glad that the membership of the defence industry working groups will be expanded to include Australian-owned small to medium enterprises who are uncertain about how this will play out and who also will feel the bumps and bruises as we work our way through this. So it's important that they have a voice on the industry working group, as they will be most sensitive to the changes, and I'm glad the government has accepted that recommendation. I should also note that the Deputy Prime Minister is committed to establishing a joint statutory committee on defence. This has been a long-term project for parliamentarians on both sides. On our side, I acknowledge Senator Linda Reynolds, Senator David Fawcett and the late Senator Jim Molan, who've advocated for this for some years. In the wake of the Brereton inquiry, I said that this is a missing piece of institutional architecture. I think when Australians go to war, we should all support our troops in the field, but there should be a forum where we can ask hard questions of our generals, particularly on strategy and operations, and I think that's the missing piece. So as we go forward with AUKUS, I think as well this sends a signal to the US and to the UK that we're serious about ensuring that we hold defence accountable, that we ask the right questions, but we do it behind closed doors because our adversaries are watching and they're looking for any cleavage they can find. And we're seeing it right now in the media with the former Prime Minister doing his best to undermine the AUKUS agreement. So I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his willingness to move at speed on this. I note, of course, the member for Bruce and his work through the War Powers Inquiry into international armed conflict and his recommendation for the establishment of a joint committee on defence. If I can be so bold, I see this as being a comparable committee to the PJCIS, bound by secrecy provisions, parties of government, sensible people, and a training ground for people who might one day serve as Defence Minister. And I think that would be a really important development for a lot of parliamentarians who care about our troops and want to see the best for them. So once again, looking forward to seeing that legislation when it comes. Finally, Mr Speaker, I just want to mention a few things relating to AUKUS. And thank you for attending the chamber, Deputy Prime Minister. It's a good opportunity for me to mention them. Submarine Rotational Force West. I want to highlight a few things that I think are of concern. We know that the plan to upgrade HMAS Stirling doesn't begin until 2025, so timings are tight, and I urge the government to move at best speed to make that happen. I'm also concerned about the housing shortage in WA. Many of us across the country feel the housing shortage. It's acute, but if we're going to have US and UK families coming to WA, it's going to be even more acute. And we talk about social licence for nuclear-powered submarines. I think there's also a social licence required for foreign personnel living alongside Australians, particularly when there is an existing housing shortage. And I know local governments are very keen to sign off on development approvals. They need leadership from the state government, and we need to get more houses built at speed so that we can welcome our friends when they come in 2027. Another issue that has been raised to me is that the top two occupations of US military spouses are nurses and teachers. Nurses and teachers. And we have a shortage of those in this country, and their accreditation is not recognised in Australia. So when they post, it'll be hard for them to find work, and we need more nurses in WA, we need more teachers. New Zealand recognises those professions. And so I'd encourage the government, through whatever mechanism, to see how we can enable families who are posted here to get involved in our economy, particularly in those two areas, health and education, where we have large shortages at the moment. I also want the government to think about an AUKUS visa. I think that's a really important part of this. We need to be able to not only move technology and equipment quickly between our three countries, and the intellectual property and the capital and everything that goes with that, we also need to move people fairly quickly as well. And so we need people who have visas and who have recognition of their security clearances, and I think that's something that we should be placing close attention to. And then finally, I just want to mention the recruitment and retention crisis in the ADF. We know the ADF is below strength. We know we're not hitting the targets. Deputy Prime Minister, we want to see more people in uniform serving our country, and AUKUS is a great opportunity, kids, so keep looking up there, but you are the future of this country. I benefited greatly from an education in the Australian Defence Force, just over the road at the Defence Force Academy. Every opportunity I get to speak to high school students, I mention the opportunities that will come with AUKUS. And so the message has to be one of service, one of opportunity, one of aspiration, and we need to get cracking. So, Mr Speaker, thank you for the opportunity to speak. Glad we could get this done, and I look forward to working to make sure that our Navy personnel and the Australian people have everything they need in the years ahead. Thank you.